Good day, students. Today we will cover Unit 8, Lessons 1 to 2. You will be learning about formal versus informal language and familiar, direct, and simple language. Are you ready? Let's get started. Meet Mary and Jen. Mary says, "Hello," and Jen says, "What's up?" Jen and Mary are sisters, but they are still different as can be. Jen likes green and Mary likes purple. Jen likes to wear brown shoes, and Mary likes to wear blue shoes. They differ in so many ways, but they differ the most in the way they talk. Whenever Jen talks, he uses formal language. Whenever Mary talks, he uses informal language. As you can probably tell, Jen is more serious, while Mary is a bit more laid back. The way they differ from each other is an example of formal and informal language. Do you speak to your classmates the same way you speak to your teachers? If you were to write a letter to a government official, would you use the same language you use when writing a letter to a friend? You probably subliminally change the language you use depending on the person you're speaking to. This lesson will help you differentiate the concrete difference between formal and informal language. Now, why is it important to know when to use formal and informal language? It is important to know when to use informal and formal language. Formal language brings you to the freedom to express oneself and your identity. Formal language will also be practiced most especially in writing for professional or academic purposes, like university assignments. Formal language does not use colloquialism, contractions, or first-person pronouns such as I or we. Informal language, it is used in personal texts meant for family, friends, and colleagues. When you send an email or write messages to friends and family members close to your age, it is usually the type of language you use. Just like what I have here, an example. Hey, feel like you're hanging out later? Not feeling well 8 p.m. Maybe tomorrow. This exchange of messages from friend or a family member is an example of informal language. An informal language is a language that you use every day, and there are some places you may find informal language. For example, at home, on the sports field, with your friends, among kids and teenagers, at the park or playground, or any place that is casual. Some traits of informal language include contractions, personal pronoun, slang and idiom, fillers such as um, shorter sentences, shortened or less complicated words, and sometimes less proper and polite. Now, what is a formal language? It is used in academic, business, and official texts. This is the language used when writing formal correspondence and memorandums, both in school and work. I have here an example. I am writing to inform you that our kitchen area will be under construction as we remodel from August 23 to August 28. Please use the makeshift kitchen on the second floor. If you have questions or concerns regarding the remodeling, you can access the full report here. We truly apologize for the inconvenience. As you can see, this text is not for a friend or just for a family member, but this text is a formal or official text. Take a look at the following examples. Number 1, we ask the secretary to call professor and get her permission to continue our research. Number 2, we requested that the secretary to contact the professor and obtain her permission to continue our research. Notice the following differences. For example number 1, they use the word ask. And for example number 2, they use the word requested. For example number one, they use the word call. And for example number two, they use the word contact. For example number one, they use the word get. And for example number two, they use the word obtain. The words ask, call, and get in the first sentence sound informal. It is acceptable to write in such informal language to a close colleague, a friend, or family member. On the other hand, the words requested, contact, and obtain in the second sentence sound formal. It is appropriate to write in such formal manner to a person of authority in school, the workplace, and the government. Take a look of the examples I have here. Under the informal language, if it's use of contractions, use of phrasal verbs, use of slang colloquialism, and use of point of view. You should always remember some traits of formal language includes no contractions, lack of personal pronouns, longer, more complicated sentences, bigger and more sophisticated words, follows etiquette guidelines, and it sounds extremely polite. Another example of informal and formal language is it observes sentence structure, the use of active or passive voice, and punctuation. For you to really internalize and absorb the discussion about formal and informal language, I have here my last example, and I want you to comment in our comment section down below which of this announcement is a formal or a formal one. Okay, is it the first announcement which has a smaller box or the second announcement which has a bigger box? Comment down below. Now, since we are already done discussing lesson 1, formal and informal language, we will proceed to lesson 2, familiar, direct, and simple language. Having a large vocabulary is a great thing. It helps you understand more things and allows you to express yourself in various ways. However, when your intention is to communicate rather than express yourself creatively, it is better to stick using familiar, direct, and simple language. If you use language that is difficult to understand, more often than not, your audience will lose interest in what you have to say. How does using familiar, direct, and simple language aid communication? I want you to put your answers in our comment section and I will just read it, okay? Now, a communicator has to make sure that he or she uses the appropriate language for the target audience. Choosing what to write or speak using familiar, direct, and simple language rather than in a complicated one will allow the audience to understand the message more clearly. I know every one of us has a familiar language, but what is really a familiar language? It makes use of words commonly found in everyday life. It is also often called informal language, as what we have discussed in lesson 1, and as both can be heard or read on a regular basis. I have here an example of a familiar language and compared to the language or the words that is not so familiar to us. The first one is a message from Erwin sending to his grandma. Gran, good morning. And his grandma replied, top of the morning to you. So as you can observe, the reply of the grandma is not so familiar to us. It's new to us. It's not common. And I also have here another example. I would like to know how the incident happened versus I would like to comprehend how the incident transpired. So the first example is much more familiar to us rather than the second example, right? If the familiar language is our everyday language or an example of informal language, A direct language now makes use of the words that are straight to the point. For example, I don't want to watch the movie. So from that example, we can't make any assumption because it's very understandable. It's very direct. Now, the second example is I'm not sure I'd really appreciate that movie. So again, it's a direct or it's an example of a direct language. It's a straight to the point statement. Another example is the plot is dull and boring. It would be best to change it. The story has many admirable qualities, but you might want to consider improving the plot. So this constructive criticism is very straight to the point. If I'm the person who is referred to this opinion or this constructive criticism, I will easily get the point of that person, sending me the message of that statement. So that's how direct language works. If a familiar language is our everyday language, or we call it informal language, we also have direct language, which is a statement that is direct to the point. Now, we have here a simple language, which is similar to familiar language. It makes use of the words that are commonplace and easy to understand. For example, I like her. She's very friendly. I am quite taken with her. She has an amiable disposition. The speech was bad. The audience hated it. The speech was in such execrable taste that it revolted the audience. So this example is obviously an example of simple language. It does not give another assumption to the one that will read it, but it will directly give the meaning and it's very understandable. Notice the difference between language use. She gave a lot of excuses for her mistakes. The secretary offered a plethora of excuses for her shortcomings. Please give me a pair of those shoes in size 7. And lastly, I want those shoes in my size. Now, I want you to identify which of these examples is a familiar language, a direct language, and a simple language. I want you to comment it in our comment section down below. Familiar language versus obscure language. A familiar language is that which the readers easily recognize and understand because they use it on a regular basis. It is our responsibility to create a sense of commonality between the person we are communicating with. By using language that is familiar to others, the message is likely to have more impact, rather than using words that are astounding, and it will just not create a different interpretation to the listener or to the reader. Direct language versus indirect language. A direct language is used when you want to express something clearly, concisely, and candidly. Indirect language often sacrifices clarity, but at times it makes the language more colorful, polite, or intentionally difficult to understand. Simple language versus complex language. A simple language is obviously easier to understand, whereas a complex language is difficult. At times, complex language is used to demonstrate or reflect formality, superiority, and academic achievements. Now, to wrap it up, we have discussed about lesson 1, which is the informal language and formal language. And we also have discussed lesson 2, the familiar, direct, and simple language. Now, what is an informal language again? It is used in personal text meant for family, friends, and colleagues. When you send an email or write message to friends and family members close to your age, this is usually the type of language you use. And a formal language is used in academic, business, and official texts. This is the language you use when writing a formal correspondence and memorandums, both in school and work. And also, A familiar language makes use of words commonly found in everyday life. It is often coincides with informal language, as both can be heard or read on a regular basis. And a direct language makes use of words that get straight to the point. And a simple language is similar to familiar language, as it makes use of words that are commonplace and easy to understand. I think that's it for the lesson 1 and lesson 2 in Unit 8 language use. Thank you for listening.